Welcome to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. In this podcast, we break down high-profile celebrity estate planning cases for advisors and their clients. Most celebrity estate catastrophes are based on the same issues that everyday people face, just with the volume turned up. Our goal is to identify and extract the individual estate planning issues that lie at the heart of each story. We then discuss what advisors should expect and how to avoid common pitfalls. Hosted by WealthManagement.com Senior Editor David Lenok.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of WealthManagement.com's Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous. For anyone new to the podcast, in each installment, myself and a guest take on a different celebrity estate and attempt to extract some key lessons that planners can apply to their more traditional clients. The idea being that celebrity estate planning stories, although often ridiculous in their details, generally have at their cores very basic issues that can just as easily apply to non-famous or fabulously wealthy clients. To learn more about estate planning and how you can better serve your clients, visit wealthmanagement.com/trusts-estates. Our monthly journal features tax law updates, wealth planning, retirement strategies, and much more, written by thought leaders in the industry. That's wealthmanagement.com/trusts-estates. Now, our guest today is Thomas Kopelman. He's the head of community at estate planning platform wealth.com, notably not affiliated with wealthmanagement.com, though a funny coincidence, and co-founder of All Street Wealth, a financial planning firm for 30 to 50-year-old entrepreneurs and those with equity comp. Thanks for joining us, Thomas.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think it's actually funny that you mentioned the wealth.com is not the same as wealth management, because when I first met wealth.com, two of the co-founders came up talking to me, and I thought I was talking to people at wealthmanagement.com until about an hour into the conversation. So that's funny.
Yeah, I had the same reaction to it. I was like, is this one of ours that someone just never told me about? But it's
Exactly.
just a fun coincidence. So the subject.
Well, thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming on. We're going to talk about Simon Cowell today, the former UK-based talent agent and record producer, best known in the U.S. for his stints judging reality shows like American Idol and America's Got Talent, sort of being the jerky judge in the black t-shirt. The 64-year-old Cowell recently revealed that he plans to leave no assets to his son Eric when he dies. Eric is currently 10 years old. And he's quoted as saying, "I don't believe in passing down from generation to generation." So his $600 million net worth estimated will go to children or dogs charities. I'm not too interested in money, he said, but I don't aim to have some pot of gold for my son at the end of the rainbow. I'll take what my folks stated. College will be paid for, and then you must start. So disinheritance, when it comes up, it sounds like this scary and emotionally loaded word. It's really like a spooky term, but it's not entirely uncommon, particularly amongst the wealthy who are very afeared of the dread plague called Affluenza. Thomas, you've recently shared a number of interesting thoughts on disinheritance on X, on Twitter to most people. Do you mind expanding on them for our audience? And do you think there's a right or a wrong way to do it?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's the best way to ask the question, because I don't think it's my job as a financial planner to tell anybody what's the right or wrong way to do anything. And so I think when you read comments on posts like this, you get a lot of people saying, that's totally wrong, really selfish, your kids are going to hate you, like, how can you not help them? And then you see people on the exact opposite side of the spectrum who are literally saying, like, this is ridiculous. Like, no, this is exactly how it should be. No kids should be given any money. Like, they should be able to fend for themselves. If you give them too much money, you're going to ruin them. They're not going to have any purpose. They're going to have nothing to work towards. And depression is higher among those type of people. And honestly, both of those sides are kind of true at times, right? There are kids who can receive hundreds of millions of dollars, can have a great life, have a lot of value, not be ruined. And then somebody could be in that exact same situation and be the opposite. And so my thought on a lot of this estate planning stuff is, you really got to talk to people and get to know them and think about what's important to them before you're really giving any advice on, yes, help kids, don't help kids. And perfect example is, I have some very high net worth households I work with. One of the households, he's planning to sell his business in the next couple of years, should be $100 to $200 million. He owns 88%. And this was a really, an interesting conversation we had in the very beginning. We started talking all the advanced estate planning strategies. We have slats, and then you have dynasty trust, and you have all these different things. And he was like, hey, to be honest, I have no want in doing any of this. I don't care. This is going to save me a projected $30 million on estate taxes. At the end of the day, I don't want to give my kids anything. And I think when people hear this, they kind of think that the parents don't really care about the kids and they don't really want to benefit them.
Absolutely.
But in reality and in real life, when this situation happens, they're just not trying to leave them a pot of money. These families are still helping their kids. And right with the example you just talked about, college was going to be paid for the kid. He is going to be able to get interviews and have jobs at places that he wouldn't have been able to. I guarantee they help the grandkids. I guarantee, everything that they've ever wanted and needed until they're out of college is still covered. They get to go on trips with him, I'm sure. And so I think that there's this misconception that it means because you're not leaving tens of millions of dollars to your kids, you're not benefiting them. When in reality, a lot of these parents are like, I'm going to benefit them while I'm alive. I'm going to help them do a lot of things, but I don't think that they should get a 10 to $100 million trust because of what I know that can do to a lot of people.
Yeah, it is a really weird assumption to make, right? Where it's like, oh, we're not even going to think about all the taking care of your kids you're doing while you're alive. We're only going to start caring about what you do after you die. It's like a very odd sort of way to look at it. Like, oh, no, we'll just, of course you take care of them when you're alive, but what do you do after you're gone? That really determines what, how you feel about your kids. It's very silly. And it's one of these things that's very nuanced at the end of the day, in terms of why you do it. And it's one of the reasons, I thought it was interesting, that, I saw your tweets and just, the nature of the internet and communication on the internet in general, especially now that advisors are doing so much more of it and sort of kind of trying to sell themselves a little bit by taking semi-hot takes. And, there's no gray area on internet communication, right? It's sort of the sad truth of our country and the world at this point. And this is one of those issues where you can really see it. It's either like, oh, you hate your kids, you're an idiot, you're wrong, or the other way, you're an idiot, you're wrong, you're going to mess them up. And it really highlights that an issue like this, where like, no, like there is no answer. Like the answer is completely different for everyone. And you need to like get off the hot takes with this and start talking to your clients and actually do the hard work of working out what it means for them.
Yeah. And I mean, again, I think you're so right that there isn't a right or wrong answer here, but like I really do like with my own wealth and what I'm trying to build towards, what I really identify with is, spending on the people that you care about while you're alive. And, backstory about this is like my grandma, pretty wealthy person. She started a business with like $750 about 40 years ago. And, she's somewhere close to, let's say, 10 million net worth now. She worked really hard. She grinded. She didn't have wealth later on in her life. And the biggest thing that she's instilled in our family was not to hoard her money, but to use it to help people in her family while she's alive. So this was, she would take grandkids on a trip a year, wherever they wanted to go. She would take them, spend time together. She helped pay for all of the grandkids' colleges. She just did a lot of different things like this, where it was like, I'm going to benefit you. I'm going to watch the impact of this. And I'm going to help you when you're younger, which is when most people benefit the most from things like this. And if you think about the average time a person gets an inheritance, it's typically almost when they're retired.
Yeah,
right?
almost 60 usually, I think. Is the
exactly.
It's like 59.
Yeah, late 50s. And that's typically where you hope that somebody doesn't need an inheritance, right? If they planned well throughout their life, that's a time where money is going to have the least impact. Caveat, of course, if they didn't save and they always counted on this, like that is a much needed situation. But in general, helping your kids when they're in their, early 20s, maybe it's a down payment of a house, maybe it's making sure they don't have student loans, maybe it's help paying for daycare or a nanny when their kids are young. Like that is the time where you can actually really move the needle on helping them get started on the right foot. And I know for me, as I build wealth and I have kids, like my goal is going to be, I think there's this great quote from Morgan Housel that's like, you want to give your kids basically the right amount of money where you don't ruin them. And like, that's different for everybody and you have to get to know them. And then there's the whole hard part of like, well, if you're not equal, then there's family dynamics. So I think it's this really touchy subject, but I do love the idea of let me help my kids while I'm young. Let me help them while I'm alive. Let me do things with them together that can create memories and experiences that potentially change their life and not be as focused in how do I give them a pot of money when they're 60 years old.
Yeah, I love that you brought up the idea of the kids being old too, because I mean, it's something that I like to highlight on every episode when it comes up. We talk about, the air quotes, the kids an awful lot in, estate planning context. And realistically, in your head, when you hear the kids, you think like, oh, somebody's teenage son or their 10-year-old. But in this context, it's
Exactly.
often a 60-year-old whose kids have kids that are that age.
Exactly. Like I'm thinking about this,
And
right? My grandma's still here. She's in her mid 80s, right? And
yeah,
I'm the youngest grandkid. I'm almost 30.
so
But
it's like,
somehow
look,
we all assume that inheritances come when you're in like your
yeah,
30.
look further down the line and somebody, and send that money there while you're alive and you can get more out of it. And, the person you give it to will get more out of it too, pretty often.
Yeah.
The other thing I heard you used the word equal, and there's another sort of trigger in estate planning for me where it's like the scariest word in the space, right? Because what the heck does equal mean, in
It's
terms
so
in terms of
important.
estate planning?
It is literally, I mean, estate planning is and just money and passing money through family is probably, you know, the area of the biggest conflict. And it doesn't matter financial situation wise, right? Like you can have two kids, one can be very wealthy, the other one cannot be very wealthy. And that wealthy child, like a lot of times they just view it as love, right? Like, oh, you love my sibling more, you're giving them more
Yeah,
help.
it's
Or
just a
like,
dollar amount on love, like mathematical.
exactly. I've seen this happen where, grandparents like, hey, I'll help pay for, my grandkids' school, but other side doesn't have kids. And so they're like, well, we'll just give you this money because we know that you're going to feel like we're not benefiting you in the same way as them. And, sometimes the best thing is just to go with equal because a lot of people are very sensitive about it. I'm somebody who I would not feel that way. Like if my sibling was struggling, I'd much rather my parents help them than be worried about giving me the same amount of money when I'm doing totally
Mhm.
fine. I don't think everybody thinks that rationally.
Yeah, and like anything else, like everything you were just talking about, that sort of thing, if you're going to not give numerically equal, so much better to make that decision while you're alive and let people know so that they have time
Totally.
to process it. You can explain yourself. They're not just getting it from a stranger on a piece of paper and having to deal with after they've just had a major trauma, right? And then they have all these emotions, and all of a sudden, oh, my brother got more than me. Like, even if you don't think you care about that, you find out all sorts of things that you didn't know you cared about when
So
somebody
true.
close to you dies.
Yeah, I mean, so true. It's definitely just money is about the hardest dynamic, and the more wealth that you have, the harder the dynamic becomes
Yeah.
among family. This is, obviously where life insurance becomes a really incredible tool, right? Like, hey, we're going to have a $5 million life insurance policy and we have, two kids, each are going to for sure get this $2.5 million and we're going to call it good, right? Like we're going to keep it simple. Everything else can get donated, can go to different charities we care about, go to spouse after the first one passes away, etc. But I mean, it's a really hard dynamic and I've watched it play out in a lot of families. I mean,
Yeah.
personal story of, a significant other I had growing up, her family was, they had a grandpa who was very, very wealthy. And he eventually said, I'm not giving anybody any more money because every time I do, somebody is complaining that they didn't get anything.
Hmm.
And he's like, I have 5 kids. They all are married. They all have kids. Like it is really, really hard to help people when they need help and then make it equal. And because you guys have ruined this, I'm just not going to give anybody any more money because it has made my life horrible. And, that is not where you want to be. You don't want to feel like you've made all this money and it's your obligation to help all of these people in whatever way they want, like you're their personal piggy bank. And I mean, I totally empathize with that. I can understand how that'd be hard. And I think that's where people like Simon have, become pushed into that spot, even though he only has one child. But in general, people just end up getting, a little frustrated by that, where they're like, fine, nobody gets anything. We're going to help charities that are going to be very grateful for our money. Sorry.
Hmm. It's kind of the funny truth of estate planning that the best way to ensure that it goes smoothly and doesn't get messed up is to just like kind of engage with it as little as possible by doing a ton while you're alive. So it's like
Yeah,
the best way to make sure your estate plan is successful is almost to not make sure you don't need it in a way.
true.
So
True.
that's why I like to think of, we talk about estate planning, but really the larger concept of end of life planning is probably a healthier like discussion point there for what people actually need to do, just because there's so much more that could be done while you're alive than on paper after you're gone.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you talking about money wise, or are you
I'm
talking about?
talking about everything. So I'm talking about in
Yeah.
terms of money, but also in terms of, like I said, sometimes you don't know what you care about until someone dies. I mean, I've seen a million times where, people don't care, all of a sudden after dad dies, dad's share, there's $1 million at stake. The kids don't fight over that.
Yeah.
They don't care about the money, but dad's baseball mitt from Little League that nobody gave a crap about until just now is all of a sudden what's causing the will to be contested.
Yeah.
And it's like these sorts of things. It's like if you just sat down, you'd find you can sort of you can't head off everything during life. Like there's just too many variables. But there's a lot of the stuff like this where the way to find out that matters is to talk about whether it matters.
Totally. I think, as I take a lot of my clients through the estate planning process, one thing that I think often surprises people is really what estate planning is. I think most people think this is just like, where are my large assets going? When in reality, like almost all of that is beneficiary designations until
Mhm.
you put it to a trust. But then they go through the estate planning process and they don't think about like, oh, what type of funeral do I want to have? Do I want to be buried? Do I want to be cremated? Like, how do all of these end of life decisions get made? And you're right. Like, I think a lot of the learning about like, where do I pass things to, and decisions about what I want to happen to me and, my body, where I want to go, all of the kind of dark stuff to think about, honestly, is tough. And then when you finally have a parent or somebody else go through it, you're able to kind of learn a lot. But, my biggest piece of advice to people is like, quit putting off estate planning. It's easy to like get caught up in the sexy side of things and irrevocable trust and estate taxes and asset protection. And when really at its core, estate planning is about like, let's make sure, the end of your life goes the right way, that aligns with you, who you are, and what matters to you, and that things get to go to the right people.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of funny, like a lot of, just to give like a random example, it's like you can find times where, the person's put in all the work to get their documents really in order, in terms of their, and, after they're dead. But, but then, so they don't cause trauma to their family and everything's really close, but then they don't have a healthcare proxy. So
Yep.
their family can't actually take them off life support. So they're stuck there with, a vegetable for X number of days. And then that causes them tons of trauma. And,
Yep.
like these sorts of documents, they're very simple documents. And I'm sure, wealth.com, can we'll tell you all about these things, but there's estate planning is so much more than who gets my stuff.
Yeah. And I think you
Even though
made a
it's often
great
is very
point.
much boiled down to that.
Yeah. And I think you made a great point on like, what would you want end of life care to look like? Would you want to try to be revived and make it as long as possible? Or hey, if I reach this point, is that a point where I don't really want to keep the effort going for me? And I think like risk tolerance questionnaires, it's really important to reassess these things through
Mhm.
different life events, right? It's really easy to say, oh, hey, I would never want to have to endure this if this happened to me. But then you watch a parent go through it and you're really sad they didn't keep fighting, because you never know, right? That's a really good time to probably reassess and say, is that still the right decision for me? It's easy to say, I don't want to suffer, but then it's hard. But then you feel it as like the other person that, is this is watching your family member. And you might say, now that I realize what we all went through, I wish my dad would have fought. And so now I want to make sure that I would fight through this, or vice versa, right? I watched my dad, and how this affected my family and how miserable he was. I don't want to make my family go through that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's another sort of estate, like a broad estate planning misconception, right? That people look at doing their estate plan, and that's probably why a lot of people, you'll see a lot of plans made and then not signed.
Yep.
Is that they feel incorrectly like this is something that's being chiseled in stone, and it's this weighty document that once you do it, you're committed to it, and it's forever.
Yeah. And
And when
part about,
in reality, it's a living document. Like as you say, as you live your life, you're going to have life experiences. Your mind is going to change things. Your circumstances are going to change, not just the amount of money you have, like how you feel about things, many things, important things. And your estate plan can be constantly updated, should be constantly updated to reflect that. That's how it should be constantly interacted with, not something that is checked up, done and stuck in a drawer, and then never thought of again, and then you're surprised, your kids get to be surprised when it's crappy.
no, I mean, totally. And I think, one thing that I've seen, I think I have about 90 households I work with now, and I work with a lot of other people on one-time financial plans, or, one meeting financial plans. And I've had less than 5 people ever come into working with me, have their estate plan done ahead of time. So you think about,
Yeah.
most of the DIYers of the world, most people just don't want to pay the money to get their estate plan done, which is why I love Wealth, and that I can make sure that they don't have to pay it. I can cover that cost. But on top of that, we know that once people get it done, they don't update it. I've worked with estate planning attorneys as clients. One of them, they've had 3 kids since they've updated their estate plan. They had no kids before it, even though they work in the industry, right? It is a painful process. People don't want to go pay, a few $1,000s more. And that's one of the great things about, being able to use Wealth with our clients, is that we can update it whenever and they have no charge. So it makes it really easy. They move states, just a bunch of different situations. They have kids, et cetera. They can just go get that updated and make sure it's like following what's going on in their life.
Yeah. And I think, making the process as easy as possible is really key, whether it be through a wealth.com or just through getting it across to your clients that it's a simple process and not something that needs to be, scared of. Because I'm going to tell you, even during my brief time practicing as an estate attorney, the number of wills I had where somebody came in, we went through all the legwork, like had all the hard discussions, all the hard decisions, and then they disappeared when it was time to sign the thing. It would, the shock a person, I think, that they would go through all that work. But it's like what we're dealing with in estate planning is like a confluence of the scariest things possible for most people. Right? It's like it's money, death, and family. And like what else? What's the other list of things people are scared of? Like heights and public speaking, and that's it. So like it's like it's no mystery why. But anytime they want to make a change, even if it's simple to make the change, it's still a weighty decision because you're dealing with these super scary things. Even if the change is small, it's hard to revisit it. So anything that makes it easier, either through reassuring your clients or through using a product like wealth.com, is really really helpful in sort of getting across and ensuring that it is a living document at the end of the day and is done correctly.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I see it all over the statistic that's like 40% of clients' recommended action items actually get implemented. And luckily, this is not something that we see in our business, but I think any advisor would agree, if only 40% are getting implemented, I will guarantee estate planning is part of the 60% that doesn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a long process. It's painful. It can be expensive. Then depending on where you do, you might have to go get it notarized and you have to find 2 witnesses and all these things. So anything that can be done to help move the needle, which, document creation services is one, or having good estate planning attorneys and forcing them to go and you joining the meeting, that's another good tool. Or bringing it, not using like pain in their life, but bringing it up after, hey, I just watched my parent pass away and look how hard the estate planning is, or the whole process is, because they didn't have their estate planning done, or something happened with a different client and you have a story to be able to share with them of, they didn't take the advice, they didn't get this done. And, their family is really struggling how to navigate all of this while also going through the hardship of losing that person. I think it's really important to find ways to help do that. And there's multiple ways to make sure that these documents end up getting done.
Mm-hmm. So, we're just about out of time here, so I'm going to wrap things up. I think I'm going to close it with a question for you, Thomas.
Yep.
You've mentioned, the clients that you work with, and when you have estate planning conversations with them, when it comes up, are there certain things that tend to come up over and over? Are there any patterns that you're noticing across clients? Obviously, I don't need to be specific, but in terms of like what either they're not doing or they're surprised to find out that is important.
I mean, I think I think people are just confused about truly what estate planning is at its core. And I think, my selling point to most people is like, you have kids, you need an estate plan. Like, do you want the court to have to decide where your kids go? And, normally that's the push that ends up getting people to be like, okay, I get it. Like, that's not what I want. But I would say the other misconceptions just are around like trust. Like, I think the average person, and I've talked about this a lot on social media, when they hear trust, all they think of like trust fund babies and the ultra wealthy. They don't really think about probate taking 2 to 3 years in California. They don't think about all of their stuff being public. And so I think in general, like, it's the area that I think people know the least. I think there's a lot of DIYers out there who will pretend they know a lot about finances and they'll know a decent amount about the basics. I've yet to meet anybody who is not really in this space that knows anything about estate planning, tax planning, all of that. So it's an area we really have to focus on, especially because most of my clients that I'm working with now are 7-figure earners in their 30s or 40s, and most likely to have estate tax problems down the line.
Absolutely. And that's the time to get started too. I mean, that, it may sound silly, you're 30 years old to start an estate plan, but that, that's really when you're having the most, if you think of when most of someone's major life changes are happening, it's between 20 and 40, right? So like those are the prime times when this plan is going to need to be in place and need to be updated.
Well, that, and if you also like even on the tax side of things, right? Like if you have a business owner in their 30s as a $10 million business, they might move $1 million worth of, ownership into an irrevocable trust. And if that business 10Xs, you only used $1 million of your exemption to get 10 million of your estate, right? I think people get so caught up in like, well, if I'm going to do it, I have to use the entire exemption, when they're failing to realize that, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years of growth outside of your estate is actually really, really impactful and uses such a small amount of the exemption.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's about all the time we have. I'd love to thank Thomas Kopelman for coming on and sort of just running through this estate planning conundrum with us. It really is a very complex space, very misunderstood space, which is kind of why I do what I do. And that's why I like to have people like Thomas on, just who are also sort of all about trying to make things easier in what can be a very scary area. So thanks so much for coming on, Thomas.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And with that, to all my listeners, I'll see you, or I guess you'll hear me, on the next episode of Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous.
Thank you for listening to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. Click the subscribe button below to become notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of WealthManagement.com. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.